I'll open the event officially, and I would like to introduce Alison Johns, who is the CEO of Advanced HE, to officially welcome you to today's event. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And yes, can I add my very warm welcome to you all to this session, which will provide, I think, an excellent briefing on the Student Academic Experience Survey. I'm delighted to be joined by Nick Hillman, the director of the HE-HEPI, Higher Education Policy Institute. This is a joint partnership between us and HE-HEPI. It's been going on for a number of years, and I'm delighted that we work so well together on this. And joining us in the presentation of today's report will be Jonathan Neeves, our head of surveys and business intelligence, and Rachel Hewitt, the director for policy and advocacy at HE-HEPI. I would just like to reinforce Sarah's message that this report and its contents are embargoed until just after midnight tomorrow. So it will be live from 1 minute past midnight on Thursday, the 11th of June. And this really is an exclusive preview for our members and subscribers to the survey. So can I please ask that you do keep this information confidential until then. I think this year's report actually is really interesting. We are seeing some really positive changes this year, and I know my colleagues will tell you more about this in a minute, but I'm delighted to say that we can see a marked improvement in assessment. And actually, COVID perhaps wasn't all bad in terms of how remote learning in post-lockdown has actually supported greater student engagement with staff, and looks like it's even improved directed independent learning. As always, though, there are things for us to learn, and you will hear from colleagues who speak soon around value for money, what's happening there. Well-being remains a concern, and of course, BAME students, a very, very big concern here in terms of the less positive experience. But I don't want to steal too much of Jonathan and Rachel's thunder. I think the thing I do want to say is that this report provides a very reliable evidence base to inform policy decisions. And we're all at that stage, whether it's in institutions or agencies within the sector, trying to make sense of this landscape, trying to make policy decisions in a world where we've never faced so much uncertainty. Well, we've got the student voice here and some very certain and some very clear messages to them, from them to us, I should say. And a helpful set of policy recommendations for us all to consider. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Jonathan now, who will speak to 10 minutes on part of the findings from the report, and then he will be followed by Rachel. We will have time after that for 10 minutes questions and answers before I introduce the panel, and there'll be further opportunity for Q&As after that panel. Could I invite you please to put any questions that you have in the little Q&A box, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And I will be curating those and collecting them up to fire at Jonathan and Rachel when they finish speaking to us. Thank you very much. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Alison, and good morning, everybody. Right, let's start with my section of the main findings. Just very briefly on methodology, we spoke with the help of YouthSite, as usual, through their student panel. We spoke to 10,000 undergraduate students studying in the UK between 17th of February and 4th of April 2020. Now, half of those interviews were done just before. In the weeks before the lockdown came in, and half were done afterwards. That was just the way it fell, but it does give us some really interesting comparisons that we're keen to make sure come across in both in the report and the presentation. The first headline we'll go through is value for money. This is a key metric we measure each year and has been rising positively the last few years from a more difficult time back in 2017. Unfortunately, that hasn't been maintained this year. There has been a fall of 2 percentage points, which is statistically significant. If it's in bold, it's a statistically significant difference. And that's mirrored by a rise in students who believe they've received poor or very poor value. That's not, I know it's not a huge difference, 2 percentage points, but we believe that the pandemic is one of two main factors that's had an impact on this year. If you look at the interview date, so students who were interviewed before March the 16th, which is the date we've looked at for the lockdown, their score is 40%. If it's after that date, it's 38%. So actually that 40% figure is very similar to what it was last year. So we're not talking about huge changes in value for money, despite a number of things that have been going on, but we do believe the pandemic has had an impact. We'll show you what kind of impact when we look at the open comments in a couple of slides' time. We also looked at value for money by domicile. This is where students are from, which isn't necessarily where they're studying, although that's often the same. We've looked at students from Scotland do tend to have the highest value for money, but it's fallen this year, impacted by the kind of things we've been talking about, we believe. England is the other part of the UK where there's been a statistically significant fall. Given the number of students in England, it doesn't need a large fall to be significant. There are some other falls in Wales, for example, but that's not significant because there are a smaller number of students in Wales. By contrast, students outside the EU actually shown an increase in perceived value for money. We now look at why that is. So what we do, we ask the students the same question on when they've given their answer on value, what were they thinking about? What was it that drove that? And let's look at the green bars first, and this is students who believe they received good or very good value. It's teaching quality driving it, positive things such as course content, facilities, resources, campus environment, campus buildings, and so on, a number of things. The answers are often, but not always, different for students who perceive poor value. They're actually saying it's the cost, it's the tuition fees, cost of living to some extent. So they're believing it's cost rather than quality driving poor value. There are some things, contact hours works for some, it doesn't work for others. One-to-one tuition time is a bit of a spike this year, but mainly it's cost. But and I'm leaning on to the next slide because there was something else happening. You see there at the bottom, another reason. So we don't always believe we've covered everything in our answers that we give to students in advance, particularly if we didn't know the circumstances in which we were going to be interviewing. 7% said something else was driving their perception of value. And we've never seen that before. We've never seen such a spike in students choosing to go into the free text box that we provide in the survey. And this is what they, on next slide, this is what they said this year. Two main aspects, the industrial action and strikes and the pandemic. Comments are around contact hours in almost every case, and missed lectures, contact hours. Students aren't always believing this is the university's fault. The university closed, it's not their fault, but it was impacting on their contact hours and therefore their perception of value. The main mention really was strikes, but COVID-19 also having an impact, but similar impact in terms of contact hours. And given these things going on, the overall fall in value, we would say, is actually relatively small this year. But this is an area we haven't looked at before and really drawing out what is driving students' perception of value. That said, there are a number of really positive results this year, and we're now going to go through some of them. First of all, the experience compared to expectations. If you look at the green bar there, it's twice as high as the red bar, so that students believe their experience has been better. Twice as many believe that as they believe as who believe it's been worse than their expectations, with actually a real increase in students believing it's better. Students tending to say it's been better in some ways and worse than others. That happens for such a varied, life-changing experience, but they're less likely to say this in favour of saying it's better than expected. And one of the reasons driving this is assessment, as Alison said. This is our battery of statements on assessment we do each year, and every one but one has increased this year. Some not hugely, but those three at the bottom, statistically significant increases, and there are a real number of metrics on assessment within the survey deep down this year. Also positive this year is ratings for teaching, in particular, since the lockdown was introduced. So since a lot of teaching has moved online, these teaching metrics have increased significantly, which is really, really positive, particularly directed independent learning, as Alison mentioned, but these three aspects of teaching. And the other ones we haven't charted, they all pretty much was the same before and after the lockdown was introduced. So no negative impacts on quality from the lockdown that we've seen really in this survey, which is positive. Students are working harder. This is a key area we do cover each year. And while there hasn't been major change in these measures, and there never really is, but almost all the measures are going up in terms of total hours attended, independent study, contact hours attended, placements have stayed the same. But students are spending more time in academic work, and that's generally seen as a good thing. Those who spend more time tend to be happier with their contact hours. Class sizes are reducing. Something else we wanted to flag up, you can see the time spent in classes with a large number of students is declining. By contrast, time spent in classes with a smaller number of students is increasing. So again, generally positive direction of travel here. Less positive, and a really important point, is the point about well-being. So we compare students from our survey to, in the purple bar, the younger population in the key ONS figures. The key ONS comparison is 2019, when there was the last major data, but our students across all years of our survey significantly lower on all those key aspects. And with the exception of anxiety, of low anxiety, which has increased, which is a good thing, all the other aspects have significantly fallen, which is a concern, and we know it's a major issue being looked at across the sector, and that continues to be the case. We think there's a link between preparation. Students who are prepared for their future and have learned a lot, they tend to have better well-being and to feel better. They're looking towards the future, and this is underlined by something we're looking at, the new area I'm going to showcase over the next couple of slides. We asked a new question this year. What's the main reason why you chose to go to university? Why was that? We wondered whether social aspects would come through, whether other things would come through, but it's actually to get on the career ladder is the key reasons, ahead of following an interest in a subject. More social aspects, such as all my friends were going, thought I'd enjoy it socially, not hugely coming through. There are some differences where we found them. They were between students who went to a private school, went to a state school. Students who went to a private school, more likely to mention the social aspects, which is interesting, but overall career aspects dominate. Even when you're 16, 17, 18, making these decisions, career aspects do dominate. And the final chart I'd like to go through is looking towards the future. We asked what you believe will be the major influence on your future success. We speculated, might it be background, type of university, course, or other things? Skills come out ahead of the class of degree, which is really interesting and significant. Course shows the course is ahead of the university. Background aspects less significant. So students really believe their own achievements will determine their future success. Really strong finding coming through. There was a difference, again, students from private school, slightly importance of, if you like, social capital related points, such as my family connections. You can see students from private school, my circle of friends, the school I attended, the university I went to, more likely to say this, but even for those students, they're still relatively down the list. So students tend to believe in their own achievement, but with some recognition of social capital for students from some backgrounds. Now, those are the main areas I'd like to go through today, so I will now pass over to Rachel to go through the next section.
Jonathan, before Rachel starts, there was one question that came up, and I think it might be helpful to answer it now. It's
Sure.
very briefly about contact hours. It says, can we assume that this is to do with face-to-face rather than alternatives in place for online distance learning? So, contact hours. What do we mean by contact hours? Are we talking actual face-to-face?
We are, the definition doesn't mean it has to be face-to-face. So when we saw contact hours have gone up, that can cover a range of, it's scheduled time learning, be that virtually or face-to-face. However, in the open comments, and it's a very good point, students are sometimes equating what they perceive a lack of face-to-face contact hours since the move to online, affecting their perceived value in some cases. So although contact hours in the official definition can be a range of things and will need to be a range of things, some of those students, particularly at the beginning, it might be changing now, but at the beginning were mentioning, well, they're perceiving they're not having that value because of the lack of face-to-face. But that was at a point in time.
Thank you very much. Thank you for clearing that up. Rachel, let's hear from you. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison. So we've been asking a question for a number of years of students about whether they feel they've got enough information on how their fees are spent. And it was actually the topic of a HE-HEPI report that we published a couple of years ago, recommending that universities did more to provide transparency on this area. And for this year, we can see the first significant change in students feeling that they're getting better information on how their fees have been spent. And we know this has been accompanied by work by Universities UK in terms of how that information can better be presented to students and that kind of transparency given. So it's a positive change in students feeling better informed in this area. And this links to students then supporting greater support for university spend on areas that perhaps are less student facing. So things such as the kind of civic role of universities, future student recruitment, but also research staff and management staff. There's greater support coming through this year from students for those areas. But obviously the predominant areas where students support the spending on really relate to teaching and learning, and also those support services that they lean on. And I think that's important for universities to reflect on as we move through a challenging financial period over the next year, and thinking about which areas are particularly important to students if cuts have to be made. For the first time this year, we broke down the results by whether students had gone through clearing or not. And obviously clearing is now a particularly important part of the application cycle. So it's good to see things like those clearing students actually find that their experience goes on to exceed their expectations. Although of course it could be related to students having lower expectations going into their university. But I think as we look at the factors that impact the student journey longer term, we can see that, for example, clearing students are less likely to choose the same university and course again if they had their time over, and significantly less likely to feel that they've learnt a lot during their studies. And I think it's important to think about these and think about perhaps these students might need not just support in getting into university and that kind of initial process of application and the start of their university experience, but actually might need some additional support throughout their student experience to ensure they're getting the same student satisfaction. We've seen this year that students are spending more time in paid employment, and particularly spending more time in spending more than 10 hours a week in paid employment. And this comes alongside other research that we at HE-HEPI have done, and that showed that the cost of living was students' greatest cost concern, even more important to students than other areas like tuition fees. Of course, it's important to think about the fact that actually over the next academic year, students accessing paid employment might be more challenging, particularly where students are working in sectors that have been shut down by the coronavirus, such as hospitality. And so might find it more difficult to find work to support their studies in the post-pandemic world. It's also important to note that taking on too much paid employment while they're studying has been shown in the results in this survey and also previous years to be detrimental to other factors of students' experience. And so it's important to think about what we can do about this. One of the recommendations from the report was whether government should be looking at seeing whether the maintenance package is sufficient to support students going through this period where it may be more difficult for them to find work alongside their studies. Students' perceptions about who should pay for higher education remain largely unchanged. So 43% say that the government should pay more. Around a quarter say that the government should pay all, and 18% say that both should pay equal. But it's interesting to look by student domicile at the results of this question, because there are different responses from different groups. Particularly Scottish students feel most strongly that government should pay more than half of all of the costs. Perhaps that's unsurprising given that tuition is free for Scottish students staying in Scotland. And Obviously, there have been conversations going on about the sustainability of that as we move forward through this pandemic, and also thinking about lower levels potentially of international students studying across the UK. But also noteworthy that EU students are the second group who most strongly believe that government should pay the majority of the fees. And of course, there are conversations that will be going on over the rest of the year as negotiations around Brexit continue, and whether EU students should pay the same level of fees as international students. So I think this is an important finding really to reflect to government as they go through these conversations around EU student fees. So this is a new question for this year, and we asked students how well prepared they feel for the future, as well as questions that asked them how well prepared they felt entering higher education. So the majority of students do feel prepared for leaving higher education and going on with their lives, but actually a significant minority, just over a quarter, do not feel prepared for the future. And this is something that we looked at in a report that we published a couple of months ago now, looking at students' views during the pandemic of entering the labour market and seeing some of the concerns coming through there. And really, it's an area, I think, where students are going to need more support than ever in moving on into the labour market, not just support for the student experience while they're studying. And I know Advanced HE have done work on this, relaunching their employability framework today. So that support for students is going to be particularly important for those leaving and entering the labour market. It's good to see that most students, if they had their time over again, would make the same choices. So around 2/3 said they would make no changes to their higher education experience in terms of the university they study at and the course they study. Only 4% say they would rather do an apprenticeship, and only 5% say they would do something else entirely outside of higher education. So those are positive results, but I think it's important, it's always important when we look at the data, to look at the different groups of students and their different student experience. And it feels like a particularly timely moment to be considering the response of students from different ethnic groups. And we can see that for white students, they tend to have a more positive experience across all these different measures than students from other ethnicities. And one stat that really stood out to me was the number of Black students being so much lower who would choose the same course in university again. Clearly, there's work to be done here in higher education to make higher education a more positive experience for students across all groups. And we published a report last year looking at how we could reduce racial inequalities in higher education. Another new question for this year was about educational technology. And we asked students which technology is used during their learning. We asked them whether basic technology is used, so things like virtual learning environments and PowerPoint slides. We asked them about more advanced technology, and for that we let them kind of come to their own conclusions about what they meant by advanced technology, and you can see in the report the kind of responses they gave to that. But the majority of students felt that the technology used during their learning was at a kind of basic level. And I think it's really interesting to see actually the impact that this has on the different measures. So those students who use advanced technology during their learning are more likely to choose the same university again, more likely to perceive better value. So across all these different measures, they're perceiving that universities are giving them a kind of better student experience. And obviously that's going to be particularly important as we move into the next year and the kind of blended learning we're likely to see. And I know Advanced HE are working with JISC and UK on how we can make the most of the kind of technology as we move forward. So to wrap up, students are starting to feel better informed on where their fees go, but there's really still work to be done in this area, and that transparency needs to be maintained as we move through a challenging financial period for universities. Students entering university through clearing might need ongoing support, not just at the start of their student experience, but throughout. Students are spending more time in paid employment, and this could be detrimental to their studies and more difficult to find over the next year. Scottish and EU students are most supportive of government paying the majority of fees. And most students would make the same choices if they had their time over again, but it's really clear that actually that experience is not the same for all students in higher education, and more work needs to be done to make that the case. Educational technology plays an important part in students' experience and will continue to over the coming academic year. And students are going to continue to need greater support in how they prepare for the future.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you. There was one question about on ethnicity, whether the students were UK DOM or including international. I answered and said UK DOM only. I think that's right, isn't it? Just to be sure. Yeah, thought so. Thank you very much. So we don't appear to have any more questions at the moment, which is helpful at this stage, because that saved us a little bit of time, and I think it'd be very good to get onto the panel now to hear their views and reflections on the report. So we have a great lineup this morning with Nick Hillman, the Director of HE-HEPI, Sian Waring, DVC at Northampton University, Eve Alcock, President at Bath Students' Union, and Dr. Zainab Khan, who is the PVC for Outcomes and Inclusion at London Metropolitan University. And I'm going to invite each of these to speak in that order. And we've got from now until, well, I think they've got 5 minutes each, basically 5 or 7 minutes each, to talk to their reflections on the report. But really, we would like to have some questions. So if you can speak for 5, we'll have plenty of time for discussion. And you can be as edgy as you like. Throw out some challenges and some provocations. I see Sian smiling there. And we're going to start off with Nick. And please just make sure you put your questions in the box in the Q&A section, and then I will curate those at the end to put to the panel. So Nick, over to you. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Alison, and thanks to Jonathan and Rachel. And I would say from HE-HEPI's perspective, this is one of the most important days of the year for us, or certainly Thursday when the report is launched, is because this survey has been running since 2006. It started when Tony Blair first introduced, just before actually Tony Blair first introduced £3,000 tuition fees. And the goal of the survey was to track changes over time. And that's why many of the questions stay the same. And track how things go up and down each year, and we have a long time series going back. And other questions, as you've heard, are entirely new, like the ed tech ones this year, so we can monitor change. And it's a great pleasure to be working with you, Alison and Jonathan, and your colleagues at Advance HE on it again. And of course, one thing that's happened in the last few weeks is universities have transformed very, very quickly, very often what they do. Our sector is seen as a deeply conservative sector, slow to change. I actually think we've probably seen the opposite of that in the last few weeks. Universities have changed very, very quickly. Of course, one of the difficulties of changing quickly is making sure you're listening to the student voice and making sure the changes you make reflect the demands of students, the priorities of students, and respond to what students need. And again, I think that's why the survey is so important, particularly because it straddles either side of the pandemic. It should hopefully, we hope, help universities listen to the voice of students. So I'll just say 3 very quick things, because I know I only have 5 minutes. The first is I'm struck by how often I read in the media or in commentary almost surprise from people. The students act rationally. The students do act rationally, and the results, I think, reflect this. So students tell us in the survey that they largely, a majority of them go to university because they want a rewarding career at the end of it. Their responses on who pays for university, who should pay for university, reflect the fact that there are public and private benefits from higher education. They don't, or at least the majority don't, say the government should pay all the costs. They reflect there should be a balance. I also think they're rational in how they're responding to the crisis, very often working even harder than before, though sadly also we've seen an increase this year in the amount who have to do paid employment on top of their studies. And it's because I think students are rational beings that I actually think, this goes a little bit beyond the survey, I actually think we'll see fewer home students deferring this year than some of the polls suggest, as I've written in a blog this morning, because I think the alternatives to higher education this year are going to be woeful. It won't be so easy to travel around the world, and it won't be so easy to get a job in your gap year. So I think we'll see students acting rationally this autumn as well. My second point is, one of the concerns we have every year when we look at the data and it comes in is how not all students are the same. And there are some worrying numbers. You know, I'm a huge fan of universities, and I see every university I speak to is working its socks off, I know, to deliver for its students in the crisis at the moment. And partly it just reflects wider problems in society. But, you know, the data does show that some students are having a less good experience than others. UK domicile Black students are one group. LGB plus students are another. Students, as you've heard, who come via clearing, and there may be more of them this year, are a third group. And I think every year when I see our data, it reminds me that you know, universities have to strive to respond to changes in the student body. It's not enough to just expect different types of students can be treated in exactly the same way as the old traditional caricature of a middle-class full-time school leaver. And, you know, I dislike it when I read in the media that students who want different ways of being supported as snowflakes. That's absolutely, of course, not the case. And I think the survey results continue to reflect that as we move, as we are now doing, from a mass system of higher education to a universal system of higher education, more than 50% of young people now go to higher education. That will need further changes in what we do as a sector. And then my third and final point is I'm always struck by the wellbeing data in this survey, which are salutary. We copy, as you've heard, the Office for National Statistics questions on wellbeing and ask them of students. And students give more negative responses than other people. Now, part of the reason for that, I think, is when you're a student, your life is unsettled. You know, it's a transition point in your life. You don't know what job you're going to get afterwards. You're living away from home for the first time, etc. But for me, I think it tells us a couple of important things we need to remember. The first is, as universities have to cut costs, as they no doubt will need to in the months ahead, weeks and months ahead, I think it's really important that some of those crucial support services are not first in the queue for being cut, and also that they're delivered online as and when appropriate. But I want to end on a positive, as I always try to do, and that is, although the wellbeing data is salutary, is worrying, is depressing, is down, statistically significantly down this year, we shouldn't remember that the experience of higher education, when you come out the other end and you're a graduate, your well-being is better, your life chances are better, your longevity is better, your health is better. And we all know that higher education is a massive force for positive change in individuals' lives. And we mustn't let the well-being data in the survey, I think, divert us from that crucial fact.
Thank you very much, Nick. And I think those 3 points about students as rational beings, that they're not all the same, and their well-being, really strong messages coming out. And I think that sets a great context for our next speaker, Professor Sian Waring, who is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor at Northampton University. What do you say, Sian?
Thank you, Alison, and thank you for the chance to join you today. Congratulations to Advance HE and to HE-HEPI, to Rachel and Jonathan in particular on this report. So I think this chance to have longitudinal trends data is hugely valuable. And as Nick has commented previously, we can see where changes in policy have had an effect and where it hasn't. And it gives us a chance to record shifts in the sector over time. And it allows us to go outside what can be an echo chamber, I think, of press, social media. There's a lot of chat, but not all of it is as grounded in evidence as this report is. And it was great to see a largely positive picture with clear areas for action, as already pointed out by Rachel, Jonathan and Nick. So there's a lot of material here, and I'm just going to pick out a few things which particularly struck me. So the first challenge which struck me reading the report was how we move from the general to the specific. So what do the responses of these 10,000 students mean for students at the University of Northampton? Now then, you know, I'm a university manager, so I am very accustomed to people responding to anything that I'm planning by explaining to me that it will work for all the other subject areas except for theirs. because their subject is different. And I'm also completely immune to the pitying look that accompanies that statement, which suggests it would be much better for everybody if I'd done a degree in their subject instead of the one I studied. So I'm aware of what I'm doing here when I say I look at this data and I think, are these our students, or are our students different? So, and I know we've already discussed, the speakers who've gone before me have already discussed how students are different from each other and how we address the differential experience, particularly of BAME students, but LGBT plus students with mental health issues. So looking at the survey, I think about 20% completing the survey were BAME. And my current university, Northampton, my previous university, which is London South Bank, was over 50% BAME. So there was a difference in profile there. And we also have students working 20 to 40 hours a week in paid work. And I picked up, Rachel was commenting on this as being the negative impact this can have on students' experience and achievement, which of course I agree with, but where we've got students in lower socioeconomic groups, they're clearly working to support themselves and their families while studying alongside that. So 20 to 40 hours a week is a great deal of study in addition to the categories identified in the report. And I also work at a university where we've got various categories of students who don't come in via UCAS. So I suspect we profile a little bit differently. But the next question is, does it matter? Of course. So I think there's a thread to pull here around marginalised voices and how we understand and represent them. And that's particularly our old students, mature students starting HE, and BAME students. And I think they are students who, if we don't explicitly seek them out, can have their voices diminished and not amplified. So they show up in the survey, absolutely, but I'm wondering if we can make them more prominent, and that would better reflect the true breadth of the sector. And I think that's important, particularly now, when the changes as a result of COVID-19 will impact more on our most vulnerable students and those less insulated by family finances. Nick's forward refers to how wonderful it is to work in HE, and it absolutely is. And one of the reasons for that is HE as a force for social justice and greater equality for voices that are currently underrepresented in positions of authority and power. So I think the value of the report is that it does give us some insight into those different groups of students, but I think we still need to do more to keep searching them out and asking how the world, or how university looks to them. So another topic in the report, again, it's picked up by Rachel earlier, was very interested in the role of technology and the categories of basic and advanced technology. And as Rachel said, what's advanced technology was left a little bit to the individual to decide. It made me think about what technology really is, because I think it's very easy for people to focus on the shiny things and the fancy things, but I think that can distract us from the actions that need to be taken to actually improve students' experience of technology. So by that, I think learning and teaching is the single most important thing that activates and releases the benefits of technology to students, and fostering agency in staff and students so that they're comfortable experimenting and solving problems. And then the other thing, which is probably the most difficult thing, is strategy for long-term investment in infrastructure and data for minimising technical debt in universities. And they are the kind of boring gubbins under the bonnet that actually make the difference. So I completely agree with the point that technology will transform education, but kind of urge us to remember that it's less about, I think, the bits you see, the silvery tech and the fancy apps, and more about how we treat our people and how we build our teams and how we plan our infrastructure long term. So working as I do in a university with a focus on professional qualifications and with many, many students from lower socioeconomic groups, I'm very conscious of the impact on work, and the sections in the report on part-time working, placements, post-graduation options, and social capital particularly resonated with me. The reduction of part-time work will impact on poorer students, and placements, which have been shown to be a force that equalises differential social capital, I think will be much more challenging to deliver for the next few years. So one of the conversations that we've had in terms of trying to think about how we deliver learning and teaching next year, it's about the ethics of placements, which potentially could take work away from people who are unemployed if companies are cutting back on staff. And we are pushing for placements, what the consequences of that for our relations with the local community. So we're looking at how we can continue to offer placements on the scale that we do by increasing the virtual aspects and utilising technology. And that's with the goal of minimising how far this COVID-19 crisis causes us to slide back in the work that modern universities have spearheaded towards social mobility. And I wanted to end on the value for money point. So I thought the list of what students view positively and negatively in relation to value for money was hugely useful. We absolutely need to provide value for money to students, no question, and understanding their perspectives is a massive deal, and that those insights will be very useful. But alongside that, we need to continue to set an agenda within that value for money debate that includes the importance of universities to social justice and to areas like environmental sustainability. And I think that's particularly true in the context of COVID-19 and recent events in the USA following the death of George Floyd, where more than ever we've got reason to focus on the benefits to individuals and wider society of social mobility, of access to decision-making positions in society for minority groups, and of research that enables us to solve social and global problems and transformation and hope. And in terms of that, the report, I think it's going to help us as universities to do more on those fronts. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sean. There's a question here, but Mary, I see, is gone now, but we will pick this up in the Q&A session later on. Thank you for taking us from the general to the specific. Lots of really good examples there. Eve.
Yes.
Well, let's have the student's perspective on the report, and particularly drawing on your experience as president at University of Bath. What would you like to say?
So I'm going to use my 5 minutes to take what we've learned from the survey findings and start thinking about the question, what will make a good academic experience next year in an extraordinary year? And there's lots of striking findings in the report, but the thing that actually struck me most when thinking about that question was the level of threat there is to experience next year. So if we take student expectations, the report tells us that universities may be becoming more effective at setting reasonable expectations and then working hard to exceed them. And yet we're currently seeing universities try desperately prospective students to still confirm their UCAS choices, apply for accommodation and go through all the usual motions. And we've heard about COVID tests, PPE and perspex screens, all cited as methods to ensure that high quality provision will be maintained. And I suspect that the gulf between student expectation and the reality in the coming year is set to widen dramatically. And the sixth policy recommendation in the report for universities to be more transparent with expectations is going to be difficult when they're reliant on student fees to stay afloat. Take value for money, for example, we can see that drivers of good value for money, according to students, are teaching quality, course content, campus buildings and student support. And yet next year, we're faced with the challenge of delivering high teaching quality online. Course content is likely to have vastly reduced options and choice because of timetabling challenges. Students might not even have proper or frequent access to campus buildings, and student support could be overwhelmed by demand. If we look at factors that drive a negative experience, we see contact hours, interaction with others, and not feeling supported in independent study as key influences. And so even if we manage to deliver high quality teaching online, live and accessible from students' bedrooms, it's unlikely this will be perceived as contact hours. And we know from UUK's bubble approach that interaction with others is going to need to be intentionally limited. And then combine that without proper support to navigate next year's academic experience. And we've got a triple threat of negative experiences on the horizon. And we could sit here and talk about how to maintain that high quality teaching and how to compensate for less contact hours or ensure feedback scores keep improving. But to do so would miss a key factor that underlies all other experience factors that has consistently decreased year on year and is under the spotlight even more as a result of the global pandemic that we're living through. And that is student well-being. Students' mental health and well-being is the foundation with which they feel able to learn, participate and contribute to university life. It doesn't matter whether a lecturer provides the most engaging and tech-savvy lecture content if your anxiety is so debilitating it prevents you from focusing, let alone opening your laptop. It doesn't matter how much face-to-face learning you receive if you don't get on with your household bubble and feel isolated and lonely with no alternative physical company. And it couldn't matter less whether your university will sustain its TEF gold standard of teaching if your depression leaves you apathetic about your own passions, let alone your degree. The fact is that we need to care as much about how the academic experience fosters well-being and social capital as we do about the actual teaching quality and course content, especially given we know that well-being impacts on students' ability to juggle their workloads, and juggling their workloads impacts on their well-being. And we know from the report that this is particularly prevalent for LGBT+ students, but I also know from my role as a representative that it's prevalent for trans and non-binary students who aren't highlighted in this data set, and for Black students for whom we have some analysis breakdown, but it's not specific to well-being. When Policy Recommendation 5 states that higher education institutions should consider how they can best support more vulnerable groups, we've got to remember that these aren't just statistics, these are people. Trans students who struggle to find community whilst living at home and talking via Zoom because they're not out to their families yet. This isn't just about the need to consider how we support vulnerable students, it's about the need to consider them first and then worry about everybody else. When Policy Recommendation 13 says more work must be done to tackle racial inequalities in higher education, it's not just because your institution's not good at dealing with racism on its campus, or because you have a persistent attainment gap. It's because our Black students are reading reports that say they're more likely to die if diagnosed with COVID-19 than their white counterparts, and have to relive fresh trauma every time they see a police officer with his knee on George Floyd's neck. I'm aware that my language feels provocative to many listening, but these are students' lived experiences right now. And that's not to mention the added general anxiety and uncertainty of COVID-19, students' financial stability, family bereavements, locked into housing contracts they can't get out of. A good academic experience and all of its parts, contact hours, teaching quality, feedback and technology, is not divorced from the mental health and well-being of the students that receive and engage with it. In order to achieve the former, we must solve the latter. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Eve. That was a wonderful analysis of the report and drawing out, I think, some of the really key issues which will be challenges, particularly in the year ahead. And there's some good questions coming up on this, which we'll pick up in the Q&A session. So thank you very much for that. If we could come to now, last but not least, Dr. Zainab Khan, who is the PVC for Outcomes and Inclusion at London Metropolitan University. And given your title, I'm sure we will be hearing something from you, Zainab, you know, as much as we're going to be interested in the experience, also about what do students achieve as well. So if we could hear from you now, that would be great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alison. Thanks also for providing me with the opportunity to join you this afternoon. I really welcome the report. It's a really opportune moment for us to take reflection on our conventional practices as we begin to sort of plan our various different scenarios as we head towards autumn. And colleagues on the panel have already touched in some detail on many of the reflections that I had looking at the report. So I'll touch on a couple of items, but I'd like to revisit the issue of BAME student experience, perhaps in the questions. I think in relation to student perception of how they feel tuition fees are best spent, I too, Sean, was really struck by some of the figures on where they are placing their rank and priorities there, both in relation to community and civic engagement. And of course, this isn't a reflection of our students' values, but rather it's an opportunity missed for us as institutions to better explain the intrinsic and tangible benefits of all of these non-student facing activities. But in relation to civic engagement, we've got to continue to press ahead with plans to embed that type of activity in our curriculum, in research where we are involving students, and of course in our employability strategies. And I think that in terms of the issue of value for money and how tuition fees are spent and student perception, for me this is really about how we effectively communicate our business as institutions and all of the hidden parts of our operations. And of course, student as partnership working has been really effective. Almost all of us now are thinking about how we move from a position of student voice and a tokenistic one-off opportunity of getting student feedback to really embedding student dialogue and partnership working to improve our governance systems, our strategic programs. And just because of COVID, that shouldn't mean we pause on that philosophy and approach. And all of us really should be thinking about how we're engaging our students in our COVID planning, both in terms of enhancing what we do, but then we'll get the long-term benefit of building trust and transparency, which for me really comes through in those statistics. And Nick, you've already mentioned that we are moving at pace, but I think that doesn't mean that we haven't got the opportunity for more participatory decision-making. Eve, I think you were so poised and articulate on the point of mental health. So I've got very few points to add to what you've already said in relation to some of our marginalised groups. Stonewall, of course, for years have been reporting some of the acute oppression facing our LGBT+ and LGBTQ students. So I'm not surprised to see those statistics reflected in the research. And we should be thinking about how we are tailoring our mental health and wellbeing provision to specific marginalised groups, and not doing two, but working with them. So student union societies, and also ensuring that we've got expertise within those provisions to make sure that we are supporting people whilst they're in lockdown, whilst we're seeing a national spike in mental health trends. And so a universal one-size-fits-all approach is not going to do the trick here. We have to take this opportunity to really tailor what we do. In relation to, again, going back to this point about value for money, I thought it was very clear that our staff are really at the heart of student experience. And I think looking at some of those indicators, I felt that there were quite depressed scores against some of the markers of students feeling that their staff had motivated them, that they had been able to pursue areas of interest, or that they had been able to initiate debates and discussions. For me, I didn't recognise any of the institutions that I'm aware of who are, and the staff, of course, that are going above and beyond at the moment to make sure that student experience is right at the forefront of what we're doing. And I think all of us would agree that our staff on the front line have played such a tremendous effort in being able to complete the semester under unprecedented circumstances. So as we move into the summer period of planning, whilst there's so much uncertainty that we will still face, we don't know what September or October will look like, this is an opportunity for institutions to really think about how they can support staff. And Sian, you've already mentioned the point about training and development, but we really need to re-energise online learning and our online pedagogy and move ourselves out of emergency mode into much more purposeful, deliberative online teaching. What we teach cannot all be neatly converted to online formats. So it means that we're going to need to have very bold and brave decisions about curricula and content. But I think this is also an opportunity for us to deal with some quite stubborn conventional academic practices, which we know are not conducive to addressing differential student outcomes and providing for a much more positive student experience from the point of mental health. So I think COVID provides us with a chance to really to really make some advances in our curriculum practices, particularly around assessment strategy. It was interesting to note the point in relation to the relationship between over-assessment and having a more positive student experience, because I think that, and the report also touches upon the relationship between over-assessment and stress. So I think in light of where we are at the moment, we shouldn't be interpreting those results as a sign that we should continue to assess in the way we have. Everything needs to be reviewed in light of what's happening. And of course, when I say that we need to be more bold and brave with curriculum, I'm not suggesting for one moment that we diminish academic rigour. I think you can innovate whilst also maintaining good academic standards. And my final point, I think, before we move on to the questions, because I am keen that we have a chance to talk about Black students this afternoon, is the point about inclusion. And Sian, you've already introduced that item for us this afternoon. But of course, we are work in the backdrop of an inequality lottery, which is playing out in light of COVID, and recent events in the last 2 weeks have also provided a new theme and dynamic to that conversation. And I think, Sian, you also mentioned the point about the respondent profile not necessarily reflecting institutions that you previously worked at, and that goes for the same for me. At London Met, 97% of our students are widening participation, and my previous institution, UE, also had over 50% of their students coming from disadvantaged backgrounds. And I would imagine that many colleagues here have also seen that over the course of the last 20 years, the student profile coming to our institutions has changed considerably. But this isn't an opportunity to celebrate. It's not merely a celebratory advance. This is happening whilst we've got acute levels of poverty increasing in the country. And we haven't, as institutions and as a sector, really addressed the issue of deprivation and how that plays out in terms of student outcomes. In terms of COVID, we're lurching towards a recession. So for some of our students, actually their futures are on a knife edge. So this presents us with a challenge as to whether we're going to rise to the challenge or if we're going to fail a generation of the most disadvantaged in the country. I personally am quite nervous and uneasy when I hear narratives that this is an opportunity for us to make the most of technology enhanced learning, and this is going to be a bold new era. Yes, there are benefits for technology enhanced learning in terms of engagement, but we've got significant challenges in relation to digital literacy and basic connectivity for some of our students. And maybe colleagues also experienced in those first few weeks when we moved on to online delivery, that we saw unprecedented numbers of students coming forward to explain that they didn't have even the most basic devices or internet connection at home, that they don't have suitable working conditions and studying environments. Eve, I think you've already touched upon that. And we know that as the economic uncertainty continues, some of our students from the most disadvantaged communities are going to be the first to lose their sources of income, and they might also continue to have caring responsibilities. So the vulnerability is multi-layered, complex, and all of this affects their ability to put their studies as priorities.
I think that's a really Zainab, could I say, I think that's a really interesting challenge to leave us with. I'm just conscious of time now.
Sure.
And we've literally just got about 12 or 13 minutes left to take some questions. And I too, like you, think that question of what we can do to support BME staff is absolutely crucial, and particularly at this time. And there's a question that's come up in the panel in relation to this. And the report itself suggests that it may be to do with pressures of employment and studying together, but I can't help feel myself that there's much more to it than that. And the question, so my question is, what do you, the panel, feel is behind this? And the question from one of the attendees is, what single change do you think would do most to enhance BAME students' perceptions of their HE experience? And given, Eve, that you spoke to us from the student perspective and that analysis, perhaps you'd like to start with that question. What do you think is behind the less positive experience for BAME students, and what do you think would do most to enhance BAME students', I don't think it's, well, it is their perception of their HE experience, but it is their experience. What could we do to enhance it?
Sure, so I want to be considered in my answer, because whilst I can give a student perspective, I will never know or understand what it's like to be a Black student in a UK university. And I think the thing that institutions need to be doing, and they need to have been doing this for a long time, but like it's so important now, is to be talking to their Black students and staff, because the fact is that the BAME communities on campus have been telling universities what they need for a long time. I'm just not convinced that universities as of yet have really, they might have heard what they're saying, but not listened. And I think it's really, really important for institutions to be open to having those conversations and learning from those students themselves. We did a forum in an anti-racist forum yesterday with students, and some of the bits that came up really, really clearly was around tailored support for them. So there was a lot of talk about the need for Black counsellors and specific sort of culturally competent mental health support, and a lot of stuff as well on increasing the confidence of students and staff to report incidences of harassment or racism or hate crime on campuses, because they need to trust that the universities will take those seriously and understand them. And then I think there's a broader point actually that we as institutions, particularly in institutions that are predominantly white or have predominantly white senior management teams, that actually there's a really introspective, reflective piece that those individuals do first about recognizing their own privilege, because it's extraordinarily difficult for them to do anything to make a difference if they don't recognize the privilege and the power that they have that comes with the color of their skin. I think you're on mute, Alison. Alison, I think you're on mute.
I'm on mute, sorry. I was just saying thank you very much for that. And I saw so many people nodding on the panel in terms of what you were saying. I think there's a lot to take away from that, and we'll perhaps move on to a different kind of question so that we can try to respond to the questions coming up. Nick, here's a question I'd be interested to get your views on. How can we best take the survey outcomes from clearing students and inform our plans for the 2021 intake, who have largely been out of the formal learning since February? What are your thoughts on that question?
Well, I think it's a fabulous question. And to a certain degree, because we are living in unprecedented times, we're going to have to learn as we go on. We haven't had a cohort that have been out of formal education for so long. But I would say one thing, that there are one or two ways in which clearing students have historically very clearly fallen through the cracks. So one obvious one is some universities have historically not given anything like the same accommodation preferences and choices to clearing students as other first year students. But when you do, you can seriously reduce the non-continuation rates among clearing students. So I think it's a matter of clearing students will always face some extra challenges because by definition, they're probably not their first choice university. But it's a matter of making sure once you've taken that into account, it's a level playing field for them with your other students.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Now, there's a question here which is directed at you, Sian, and you do seem the obvious person to respond to this one, which is about technology. And Zainab also raised the importance. We've done the emergency transition, but there's much more to do. Mary Kernock-Cook said, University of Northampton's highly tech-enabled university. Did the findings that advanced tech correlates with a better university experience chime for you? And have University of Northampton's satisfaction ratings gone up in line with tech enablement?
Well, I want to echo Zainab's point actually. So technology's worked really well for some things, and then there's things it hasn't been able to do. So I think we did make a relatively smooth transition to remote learning and teaching. We've got a system of learning and teaching called active blended learning, which has always combined digital, face-to-face, synchronous, asynchronous, and that was a relatively smooth transition, aided by very committed, very imaginative, very hardworking academic staff. So I really want to say thank you in this forum as well for all the work that they did. And we did see signs that we got more student engagement. We got lecturers reporting that modules that had lower attendance, we actually had better online attendance. And we think there was a number of factors for that. One, people weren't having to travel. It was more convenient to sort of be sitting at home, being able to join the session. Maybe people weren't going out to work. So they were better able to manage their time. So we did see engagement in session attendance go up, and some module pass rates went up. And we've also had reports from students that they felt communication was as good or better than previously. We've put a lot of effort into that. So that was all really positive takeaways. The absolute nightmare is all our professional practice courses, where we've really struggled to translate the learning outcomes virtual. So nursing, engineering, high-spec computing, where people need particular machines, all the work that nursing, midwife, paramedics do. And obviously you can recreate some virtual environments, but there are aspects where we felt people needed to be in a room with people, and that's been a real struggle. But then to echo Zainab's other points as well, I think where you've got students who, we certainly have groups of students who found it harder to engage online, and they are students who are sharing broadband, sharing living spaces, got caring responsibilities, may have health worries, may not be able to access the same tech as other students, and I think they're just getting a double whammy. And it's we've done everything we can to support those students, but we've tried to narrow the group of students negatively affected and mitigate the negative impact, but we know there are students that still aren't reaching who are at risk of kind of falling out of the system.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's that kind of digital poverty thing, isn't it, Zainab was talking about. And Zainab, I mean, given the makeup of your student population, could you share with us sort of practical actions that you are taking or initiating to support the points and the issues that have been raised here for your student population? I'm just thinking, you know, can you bring together improving the BAME experience, EdTech together? You know, there are huge challenges facing us in this. What advice could you give us from your experience and the plans that you have at London Met?
So in relation to the digital capability, we're developing a programme over the summer for new students, but also for returning students. We've got two categories of students in our minds. We've got students who need to have a digital care package, which provides them with digital literacy, but also one-to-one support to give them the basic preparation to get them online and then familiarise them with our different learning platforms well before the term starts. But then we've got a second category of students who have specialist technical needs. So Sian, you've mentioned some of the professional courses, but we also have a number of courses which require quite complicated kit in order to make for a meaningful learning environment. We're still working through what some of the solutions will look like, but it will involve a lot of summer activity. And the challenge for us is both in terms of how we support our incoming international cohort, and also because we have a large proportion of students who join us through clearing. So it's quite a tight turnaround time in that respect. In relation to the BAME issue, Eve, you set up the conversation quite nicely in terms of the challenge for the sector. I think it's obvious to everyone what the problems are. And I think there's, again, I mentioned earlier about the chance for us to deal with some long-standing issues in the sector which have not been addressed, principally around academic convention and academic traditions to do with the curriculum. Our students from ethnic minority backgrounds quite simply do not see themselves reflected in what they learn and how they learn. We don't place enough value on their different forms of capital and their previous experience that they come to university with. This is an opportunity for us to actually think about how we can build relational pedagogy, which is going to be so important as we deliver over the virtual and remote format, by building senses of connectivity. So over the summer, we're also going to be launching a series of sense of belonging, community enhancing activities, which will sit outside of the traditional course, but will provide for an opportunity for students to share their experiences and to build relationships with staff. And that needs to continue into the semester.
Thank you very much. Some really concrete advice there and some real insight. So thank you, Zainab. Here's one for you, Nick. Paul Wood at the University of Northampton. He said, I meant to ask this earlier, but what actions will result from the survey publication, as in you said we did? What answer would you give to Paul in relation to that question?
Well, I think that's a very good question, because I'm conscious that sitting in a think tank, it's very easy to say universities should do this or should do that. And it's a lot harder sometimes to drive real change through very large institutions. But of course, the lessons from the survey, and I'm sorry, this is going to sound like I'm dodging the question a little bit, but the lessons from the survey will be different for different institutions. So I'm a governor myself of two different universities, Manchester, and where I went as a student, as an undergraduate, and Buckingham, which is my local university. Those are very different types of universities, and they will need to take different lessons from this data. But it is an annual survey, so we do track changes year on year, and we can also, both Advanced HE and HEPI are committed to being very open with the data. So although we don't publish the data at a university level, we can share your own data with you for each university, and then you can see what particular questions your own institution scores least well on, and which questions it performs best on. And so I hope it will be a real aid to improvement within individual universities, and happy to take any follow-up questions by email as well.
Thanks very much for that, Nick. I think this is the real value in the report. It provides a really strong evidence base, and then institutions then need to do some deep dives themselves to find out what it means in their context, which goes right back to Sean's point about general to the specific, which you've all been great at doing. There's a really interesting comment here from Marie Inflar from Glyndŵr University in relation to your contribution, Eve, which said very provocative insights from you. The concepts of bubbles is clearly not attractive. Any thoughts on how that might be mitigated? Sounds like a big question to end with, but you know, do you have a brief thought on that question?
So I had a conversation at Bath about this, because though I couldn't see an alternative to helping timetabling, I disliked the idea. I think as far as possible, especially if this is going towards first years for accommodation allocation, and them living with people who they're also studying with and travelling to and from campus with, is the need for people to be expressing preferences in terms of the sorts of whether they want quiet accommodation or non-drinking accommodation. And I know some universities do try to do sort of matchmaking with flatmates to make sure that you have more in common with them than just you're all economic students and you're all living in X block. And that has got to be a thing, but also and as ever I say this, but the resourcing of students' unions be efficient enough and effective for them to really roll out online, virtual or blended student communities where, even if it's via Zoom, students can find people who they connect with and feel supported by, because that's where student support networks come from.
Eve, that's a fantastic place to finish off on. Thank you for those insights. It's time to finish. It's 12:45. Can I say a huge thanks to Jonathan and Rachel, who did all the hard work behind the scenes pulling out this amazing information. Thanks for the enduring and very constructive partnership, Nick, with HE-HEPI. Thank you to our speakers, to Zainab, to Eve, to Sean and to Nick. And I can see from the chats and the questions that this has been really valued by everybody who's participated today. I'm sorry we can't answer all of the questions, and we will check these, and if there's anything we can follow up with, we will. Thank you very much. We've got plenty to do, everybody. So let's get cracking. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.